Alan Sroufe was an extremely busy person while here at Whittier. The number of pages in the student index that was listed after his name far exceeded the number for most other students. So knowing that he was a psychology major and has remained in psychology and become a highly esteemed researcher and teacher in psychology, I decided to check out the psychology department in 1963. Okay. In those days, and this is who you were talking about last night with the rats, yes. Yeah. In those days, it seems that the central themes of psychology was the analysis and control of human behavior, which I thought was interesting. They further stated that the academic program at Whittier College is designed to contribute to the liberal education of the serious student, and on further exploration, I was able to see that Alan Sroufe was indeed very liberally educated. Although his major was psychology, he was a member of the Honor Society in sociology, and he appeared in photos in the English department. I was going through and I just opened up to the English department. I thought, there's Alan. What is he doing there? Okay? And here we see he was one of the basic coaches for basic communications. You talked about that last night as well, which according to the English department, quote, provides a concrete foundation in the area of communications, semantics, and problem solving. The main goal is to offer courses in the organization of the mind which will continually help the students with their life today and tomorrow. Okay. Alan Sroufe was also Alan Sroufe was also an excellent citizen of the college. Here we see him with his roommate Ned Lazaro, who is also here. Where is Ned? There he is, yay, okay, and you're also circled there, Ned. Okay, so we see him here with his roommate Ned Lazaro. They were members of the Knights, which was the junior men's honorary service organization, and to help distinguish them, the Acropolis said that you wore blue shirts with Knights emblems on them.
And our belts up to our armpits, apparently.
Yeah, belts up to your armpits. Okay. In his senior year, Alan Sroufe became a member of Omicron Delta Kappa, or ODK, which in those days was, quote, Whittier's highest honor offered to its male students. So only males in those days. But in addition to his exceptional academic achievements, it was also clear that Alan Sroufe had a less academic fun side. And in his email message to me, Ned Lazaro continued, also, Alan was an outstanding athlete. He wrestled in high school, and he quarterbacked the mighty Willie Penn Society football team to an intramural league championship, defeating the vaunted Orthogonian team in the championship game. He called all of the plays and threw all of the passes. We had come very close to 2 previous seasons, but finally in our senior year, we prevailed. We Penns of the 1963 class still talk about that victory, and Alan indeed talked about it last night. But he gave all the credit. He gave all the credit to you, Ned, for all the catches. But the next bit of information that Dr. Lazaro shared with me really demonstrated best the breadth of Alan Sroufe's experiences here at Whittier. He wrote, a couple of things that you might not know about Alan. He was a varsity cheerleader at Whittier College for 2 years. The second year, he was the head cheerleader. So we see him up there. I don't know how well you can see him leaping up above Susan Jones, head song leader. Alan has a great sense of humor, and he would come up with very witty and clever cheers, no go team go kinds of cheers under Alan's leadership. He may have been the most innovative cheerleader Whittier College ever had. You might ask him about some of his favorite cheers. So after his presentation, when he's got some time for some questions and answers, that's a good question to ask him, okay? It was also a treat to attend Whittier games because he never knew what he was going to have us yell. Okay, and then finally, notice the rock down there? Is there processing past the rock? Finally, my research revealed that Alan Sroufe was made a member of Who's Who in American colleges in his senior year. Only a handful of students from Whittier were chosen that year, and it seems appropriate that Alan was among them. So what does this tell us about Alan Sroufe? We know that he was an excellent student, an excellent citizen, a motivator in his cheerleading, but how does this relate to who he is today?
Good question.
Well, I'll answer it for you. Attachment theory tells us that our early experiences help shape who we become because they have the potential, depending on the quality of the attachment, to provide us with the motivation and resources to go out and explore our world, knowing that we always have a secure base to run back to if necessary. We also know from attachment research with the strange situation that it's the reunion behaviors that best distinguish between types of attachment. Given the swiftness of Professor Sroufe's acceptance of our invitation to come back to Whittier for this special 10th anniversary, I'd like to think his attachment to Whittier is a type B secure attachment. Okay, I know that we're very proud to call him one of our own, and perhaps with some gentle coaxing, one day he'll share the mysteries of those grasty German students with us. So I'm very pleased to present Professor L. Alan Sroufe, Whittier College, class of 1963.
Unless you have some more you'd like to say.
Later on. I'll share with my students.
Actually, you know, I'm from Minnesota now, and we're kind of shy there, so we don't, you know, it's hard for us to have all these nice things said about us. In fact, you know how you tell an extroverted person from Minnesota? Anybody? He looks at your shoes. I am going to talk to you today about the legacy of early experience. Obviously, one of the oldest hypotheses in psychology is that our earliest years have a formative influence on the way we develop and on the persons we become. This is captured by this quote from a really nice novel by a woman named Norma Rosen. She's talking about the correspondence that occurred between Dewey and Freud, and this was one of the quotes in that book. As compelling as this hypothesis is, and actually is more compelling these days as we have come to learn a great deal about how early experience influences the development of the brain, beginning with rat studies, but moving on to primates and now humans. And as we learn how early experience even impacts the expressions of genes, there's a lot of really exciting work going on these days about that. So again, this hypothesis, old as it is, remains very compelling. At the same time, it turns out to be more difficult to confirm than you might at first think. I'm going to illustrate that by first describing a few children to you and leading into some of the questions we were asking in our study and talking some about what the challenges are. First child I want to tell you about, I'm going to call Serena. Serena was, and I'm going to just describe all these children when they're the same age 10. And at age 10, Serena was a very popular child. She was well liked by the other children. She was well liked by the teachers in her school. She was well liked by the counselors at our camp. She was able to form close friendships. She had very good friendships with some of the other girls, and she functioned very smoothly in the larger peer group. She did very well in school, even though her IQ was only average. She was a good student. She followed the rules, no behavior problems. Everything was going fine for Serena. And congruent with that, her early childhood was quite positive. Even though Serena's mother was a teenager, ultimately Serena's father married Serena's mother, and with the help of both sets of parents, the father first finished high school, and then he worked for a while Serena's mother finished high school, and they throughout had a lot of social support in that family. And our direct observations showed that both Serena's mother and father were very nurturing parents. Thomas is a stark contrast. He was not well liked by peers, or in fact, he had some difficulty with the counselors at our camp as well, largely because he was physically aggressive and engaged in lots of disruptive behavior. School was going very poorly. When a challenge arose, explosive behavior would rather immediately follow. And Thomas's parents were very negative towards him at age 10, and in fact they said he just couldn't be controlled and they would just assume they didn't have him anymore. And his early history also was quite congruent with what we saw at age 10. He was chronically rejected by his parents in early childhood. his mother had run away from home when she was a child and had little further contact with his family, so there was no social support from the extended family for Thomas. And when Thomas was born, I'll call his mother Veronica, Veronica's mother refused to have any further contact with her and told her she could expect no support. The father of Thomas disappeared and was not seen again. Then later, Veronica was living with a man who was abusive, and there was a lot of violence and chaos in the home. I could go on. Now, these differences are dramatic, but how do we know that the differences in their early lives, which we observed, were responsible for the differences in behavior that we see at age 10? Because there are lots of other possibilities that we would need to consider. First of all, how can we know that the early measure is not simply predictive because it's related to later measures? So, yes, Thomas's mother was very rejecting and harsh with him when he was little, but she was also rejecting and harsh with him when he was 10. So how do we know his behavior when he's 10 has anything to do with how he was treated when he was little? And also, how would we know that his behavior at age 10 is not the result of some other condition, such as the poverty and stress that surrounded him in his early life? How do we know it's the way his mother treated him that had any impact on his behavior? Because, of course, it tends to be the case that the kind of negative parental behavior that I can describe to you is associated with conditions of stress and poverty and hardship in the home. So how do we know that the parent behavior has anything to do with Thomas's outcome? Children may be doing well because the supports are their parents are providing at an older age, or they may be doing well or poorly because of some inherent characteristic of the child. I said this in the class I talked with yesterday. How do we know that the rejection that Thomas experienced wasn't due to some characteristic of Thomas when he was a little child? How do we know that it's not simply a result, for example, of the level of intelligence of his parents, which they then passed on to him, which then maybe affected his behavior? It's actually even more complicated than this. And I'm going to tell you one more case. This kid I'm going to call Mike. Like Serena, very positive early beginnings. And when we observed Mike as an infant, at age 2, at age 3, and in kindergarten, he was functioning very well. And all the reports were positive. His teachers liked him. He was doing well in school. Same thing in first grade, he was doing well. Then in middle childhood, things couldn't have gone worse. His father and mother divorced, and that doesn't necessarily lead to terrible things for children, but in this case, the father took Mike's brother and moved out of the state and had no further contact with Mike. So Mike lost his father, but he also lost his brother. And the divorce was very acrimonious. It was preceded by lots of unpleasant things, and lots of unpleasant things followed. And subsequent to the divorce, Mike and his mother were living in very deprived conditions. When I say the roof falls in, I mean that both as a metaphor, and it was literally true in the dilapidated house in which they lived. So lots of bad things were happening. Now, when Mike was 13 years old, we have another assessment. And we notice in that assessment, I should have prefaced this by saying that Mike's mother had become very dependent on him, and we would say inappropriately so. She was leaning on him for support. Parents do this sometimes when they're alone. It can be understandable, but it's hard on a child. So she was being very dependent on him. And when we saw them at age 13 in our assessment, we could see him kind of pushing her away some, which we thought was healthy. Young adolescent, being too crowded by a parent. Unfortunately, his mother died suddenly. She went from health to death in a period of a couple of weeks. Now, in this context, when he's pushing away for her to die, you can imagine this was hard on him. So now, when we see Mike as an adolescent, remember he had these really early beginnings that were very positive. But now as an adolescent, of course he's troubled. Would anybody think that what he just went through would leave him unmarked? He both had bouts of depression, and he had some rather serious conduct problems. Now the question for us today, and I'll answer this in my very last slide. Given all that, well, what do we expect of him as an adult? And one of the main questions I want to pose to you today and answer as we go along is taking us beyond the question of does early experience matter, can you predict outcomes from measuring early experience, which I assure you can, and I'll give you a little data on that. But that's only the beginning question, because it's much more interesting to raise questions about the developmental process and to raise questions about, does Mike's early experience matter anymore, given this history? Given this whole history, how can we possibly understand what he'll be like as an adult? And I'll tell you about his case, but also present some group data. Anyway, it was a very long introduction, but I wanted to convey to you the complexities of the question. It sounds like a simple question at first. Does your early experience matter? But then when you look at, well, but there's all these other things going on. There's your later experience. There's the ongoing changes in stress and social support that you experience. The way that we chose to approach these questions is to do what's called prospective longitudinal investigation. And a longitudinal study means you follow the same kids over time. A prospective longitudinal study means more specifically that you do the assessments age by age, as opposed to, say, interviewing adults about what their childhood was like. And there are a whole bunch of questions that can only be answered in this way. And one of them is, does early experience have special importance? Another one is, do child problems precede or follow from parenting problems? So this issue of, okay, Thomas has these problems and his mom is being rejecting, but which was chicken and which was egg? How would you know? Well, if you start at age 10 and you look at Thomas, you can't answer that question. Even if you do an fMRI, because of course Thomas's brain is going to function differently than Serena's, but we don't know starting at age 10, we don't know if that was due to some inherent problem that he had, or is the outcome of his experience, or is a combination of things. If you're interested in change in behavior, you have to do a longitudinal study because you have to look at behavior over time. I'll anticipate here one question that's commonly asked, well, how do we know that all this stuff that I'm telling you isn't due to genes? Well, one way is because we look at change in behavior. So, for example, in our study, we monitored the depression level of the parent. Usually these were single families, so usually it was just the mother. And as the mother's depression went up and down, so did the child's behavior problems in a lagged fashion. So looking at change in behavior lets you have a little more confidence in causal statements. And this, my favorite question that we'll get back to. Okay. Here's the outline of our study. I'm going to try to say some different things than I said yesterday for the people that were at both. Why children of poverty? One reason was because poverty hadn't been studied, but there was another reason that was a strategic, methodological reason. Children born at poverty are at risk for developmental problems. And in psychology, being at risk is a technical term that means there's an increment in the probability of difficulties. So if we want to say they're at risk for behavior problems, what that means is more children born in poverty wind up having behavior problems than children who aren't born in poverty. And as a matter of fact, it turned out in our study that roughly half of the children that we studied developed behavior problems and half did not. And while I would never have wished that half of them would develop behavior problems, I would have hoped none of them did and that we would have had a lousy study. I would have been quite happy with that. But from the point of view of research, having half of them have behavior problems gives you substantial leverage to answer the question, what accounts for the behavior problems? And the other reason, of course, since they're all children born in poverty, we know the answer isn't those who have behavior problems is because they were born poor, because they were all born poor. So it's a way of controlling for one variable that we knew was very important, namely socioeconomic status. I'm going to do 2 and 3 together. It was very important to start this study quite early and to look in great detail age by age. In fact, in the first 18 months of life, we did 11 assessments. We did a lot of assessments before the kids were born, but I'm talking about from the time the child was born, we did 11 assessments, direct behavioral observations before 18 months. Now, why is this important? It's very important because if we want to evaluate the role of early experience, we have to also measure things like the infant's temperament. And we have to do that early on, because if you think that even something like temperament is open to change, which I certainly do, thank God, I would have never made it through Whittier College if I hadn't gotten control of myself a little bit. So if you want to say, you'll see a lot of studies in the literature, even like with adolescents. They'll be studying adolescents and they'll measure impulsivity with some questionnaire and they'll measure behavior problems. And they'll say, you see, conduct disorders is due to impulsive temperament. And you want to say, give me a break. Of course they're impulsive, they got conduct problems. You wouldn't have called it. The question is, where did the impulsivity come from and where did the conduct problems come from? It's possible that if you'd studied them as infants, you would have found that they had regulation problems as very early infants. But you have to do the study that way. And we did on purpose. And as it turns out, frankly, infant temperament doesn't predict very much. This brings us to this point, comprehensive measures across domains. So we had to measure cognitive development, IQ, temperament, peer relations, school performance. Why do we have to measure all this stuff? Well, again, we want to show that early experience has some special significance. We need to control for all those other things. I talked about this one yesterday a bit. Context is important because we wanted to understand what different parents were up against. So rather than being critical of Thomas's mother because she rejected him, it's rather important to know what her life circumstances were like. And once you know that, you can see it's quite clear why some people have more difficulty parenting. If you got a boyfriend that's beating you up every night and your mother's rejected you, it's not easy to be dealing with a little child. So nothing in our study leads us to be blaming parents. The other reason for studying context is because we do believe that as the developmental context changes, so will the child's adaptation. But our focus was on early relationships. This is the thing that we believe theoretically would be an important factor, even considering all of these other factors. We thought the child's early attachment and other aspects of quality of care would make a big difference. I want to put all three of these up at once so I can do this a little more quickly. The developmental model we have is borrowed from a man named John Bowlby, and it's called a pathways model because his view of how early experience would influence later development isn't like a model of scarring, where you had early level experience, so permanently you're scarred, and that scar will be manifest throughout your life. Rather, he viewed it as your early experience initiates you on a pathway. And if your early experience was positive, it initiates you on a positive pathway. If your early experience was negative, it initiates you on a negative pathway. But this is a pathway, and pathways are open to change. If subsequent experience is more positive, it may bring you back to a more positive pathway. And in that way, he argued development is cumulative. You have to consider the entire history of the person, as well as their current circumstances. Since this was the developmental model we followed, that's what led us to assess context, as well as early care and later care. The proposition that early care is important, again, the way a developmentalist would talk about this, it's not the same thing as saying early care, well, it's certainly not the same thing as saying early care is the only thing that's important. It's not even the same as saying early care is more important than what happens later. Because from a developmental point of view, when development is all of your experience over time, it doesn't make any sense to say early experience is more important. Someone want to repeat the house analogy that I said yesterday? For those of you who weren't here, early experience is like the foundation of a house. Is that more important than the supporting beams or the roof? That doesn't make any sense. Because if the supporting beams and the roof aren't solid, the house isn't going to. On the other hand, does the foundation have special significance? It does. It lays the groundwork, literally. Mm-hmm. It sets the frame for what the house can be. With a limited foundation, you're not going to build a castle. On the other hand, it doesn't determine forever the outcome. So it's a complicated model, but it is possible to test it. There are implications from it, and I'm going to tell you some of those. I'm gonna skip over this to just say, in a developmental view, it's not just genes and current circumstances, but your past development is also an important part of the picture. For several reasons, past development influences the expression of genes, and past development influences how you interpret current experiences. So a child who's been rejected takes an ambiguous reaction from another child as being hostile. We actually did a study in collaboration with some German colleagues where you show kids cartoons. It's like 3 frames of a cartoon, shows a child building a tower, shows another child walking by, and then shows the tower has fallen down. And you ask kids, say, what's going on here? Kids who have been rejected say, this kid walked by and kicked down that tower. Kids that haven't been rejected, kids that have experienced secure attachment histories say, this kid was building a tower, this other kid walked by and he must have accidentally knocked it down. That's the same experience. It's an analogy for how the same experience may be interpreted differently depending on your history. So history is an important variable in understanding behavior. Okay, I'll do these all at once too. This is just a brief primer on what an attachment relationship is. I know many of you already know this from the classes you've taken, but the basics are real important here. This is not a measure of the baby. It's a measure of a relationship. When I say some infants are secure in their attachment, I mean they're confident about their parents' responsiveness. It doesn't mean tightly attached. It's not a quality of the baby. It's a description of the relationship. The second point is important because you have to understand, because of our evolutionary history, you have no choice but to be attached. So all babies are attached if they're raised by somebody. Even someone like Thomas's mother, who's rejecting of him, Thomas was attached to her, of course. He's a human. He would be attached to his caregiver. He's just as attached to his mother as Serena is to hers, but his attachment will have a different quality. He won't be confident about his mother's responsiveness, and if anything, he's confident that she won't be responsive. I can't take the time to really tell you how we assess attachment, except to say that it's a laboratory procedure, and we look at the way the behavior of the baby's organized around the mother. And the babies that are considered to have secure attachments manifest this by when the mother is present, they're able to play with the toys. Okay, how does that show that they're secure? Because they know if something came up that bothered them, they could turn to their mother and their mother would reassure them. They know that. I got a great film of a little kid who is playing with the toys, picks up a toy, and just reaches back like this and hands it without even looking. Because it's in their heads now. They know. How do they know that? She's been doing it for 12 months. She's been being responsive, or he, if it's a father you're assessing. So it's that patterning of care. Then if the kid does get frightened by something, they do go to the parent. And they actively seek comforting. They're efficient in doing it. They get picked up, they hug in, they get comforted fast. We monitor their heart rates, the heart rate goes down. They're back, they're settled. They get down, they go back and play again. That's the way it's supposed to work. And with kids like Thomas and other kids that show different patterns, either they're clinging unremittingly to their mother, they're not confident if they turn their attention away, she'll be there for them. Or as Thomas would do, they fail to go to her when they get stressed because they expect they'd be turned away, and that's painful, so they don't do it. That would be, another several days of talk, but we'll go on. So this summarizes how you would see a secure attachment. Notice the active initiation of contact and the ease of being comforted. Then there's some kids, I didn't describe a child like this, but a number of the kids we study have what's called resistant attachment. They don't explore, they have difficulty separating from their mother, and more important, they have difficulty being settled. And they even mix. They want to be picked up and then they're pushing away. And then the mother starts putting them down and they squirm to get up again. And then they push away. They're fighting with her. They're unable to find it. It always reminded me of my dog when he's trying to find that perfect spot to sit down on the porch, and going around and around like he can't find it. They can't find the place that feels comfortable. Why not? Because it hasn't consistently been there for them. And then the kids like Thomas that do the active avoidance and suppress the expression of attachment behavior. Okay, disorganized attachment is the most extreme form of anxious attachment, and it is when the caregiver is frightening. So this in samples where there's extreme physical abuse, a huge percentage of the babies are assessed as being disorganized in their attachment. what this means is, even in the case of Thomas, he has something that he can do. That is, when he sees something he's a little alarmed, he doesn't go to his mom. He stays there. He doesn't leave the room, but he doesn't go to her. So he can reference his behavior to her. But if your mother's literally frightening, you feel a strong impulse as a human, and actually most non-human primates, when you're frightened, you want to go to your caregiver. That's another part of our evolution that's strongly built in. We don't go run down a hole like a rabbit would. If you scare a rabbit, they'll run to a hole. You scare a human or a primate, they'll run to their caregiver. But what if the caregiver is frightening? If that's the source of fear? Because you're also motivated to flee from the source of fear. How do you flee from the caregiver and flee to the caregiver at the same time? So this puts the child in an irresolvable paradox and leads to very incoherent behavior. It's hard to describe because how do you describe lack of organization? It can be manifest in a lot of different ways. I'll give you a couple of examples. When we do these brief separations in the lab and mother returns, a child might cry and run to the opposite side of the room. Crying says, I want to be with you. Running to the opposite side of the room says, I don't. Or the child might just go flat on the floor, down on his face with the arms and legs out, and just lie there. In other words, okay, I can't go, I can't flee, I'll do nothing. Or just go in circles. Or approach the mother backwards. We've seen all these things. And in our sample, we had about 30% disorganized attachment. And like I say, in extreme abuse samples, they could have 80% or so. The reason I emphasize this is when I get to our outcome data, which I'm going to do shortly, you'll see that disorganized attachment has major implications for predicting psychopathology. Oh boy. I'm going to go through some of this. I'm going to count on you being able to read. This is the explanation of why would it matter if you have a secure early attachment. And my argument is it provides 5 different kinds of foundations. One is a motivational foundation. So I know you can read those things. If your caregiver has been responsive to you, you develop these positive expectations. You also develop the belief that you can get what you need from other people. That's really important. So later on when you're in preschool and you're stressed, you turn to the teacher. You go to the teacher because you've learned, hey, adults will help. That's the thing to do. And I can communicate to that adult what I need, and I'll get it from them. This is what makes you a good play partner in the preschool. And this, in many ways, you could think of attachment as the dyadic regulation of emotion. Infants can't regulate their own emotions by themselves, but they can be well regulated with a responsive caregiver. And to just use the example of distress, if something distresses me, it's hard for me to, as an infant, to cope with that on my own. But I can turn to the caregiver and they can help me, and then I get settled. So I got distressed, I got aroused, and my arousal came back down. So I'm being entrained in emotion regulation in that relationship. And ultimately this becomes something that's internalized. And this was a specific prediction from Bowlby that if you are treated empathically, you not only learn to receive care, you learn that this is the way relationships work. When one person is in need, the other responds. So even as an infant, even though you're the one in the position of being cared for, you're learning about caring relationships. And when we see these children later, and we, from our films, look at what different children do when another child is injured or upset, the children with secure histories will show concern, usually get a teacher to come and help the child. The children like Thomas with avoidant histories would tend to take advantage of that child's distress, laugh at them. I remember one case, a girl said, "Oh, I have a tummy ache," and she's holding her tummy. And another kid went up, hit her right there, right in the spot she said hurt. And it's very interesting because it shows the same brains as going and getting help. I mean, it shows a recognition. This kid is hurting. They're hurting in this particular way, and I can make it worse. I mean, that's smart. It's also a reflection of a relationship history. This is what you do. When I was in pain and in need, I got rejected. That's how relationships work. That's what you do. Okay, here are some of our major outcome variables we looked at, and I select each of these for particular reasons. The self-reliance one is very interesting because in psychology, when we first described the kids with avoidant histories, a lot of psychologists said, well, those kids are just precociously independent. They just don't need their parents so much as others. But the prediction from Bowlby's theory was, nonetheless, those children will be more dependent later. So when you see them in preschool, they'll be the ones that need more care and guidance from teachers. The kids who are secure in their attachment later are more self-reliant because they've developed all the tools that I've described, and because, again, they know if they get beyond their own resources, they can turn to adults, and adults will help. So they don't need to be hovering near adults all the time. I've mentioned dyadic regulation leading to self-regulation. I'll skip the curiosity, and the competence with peers was our major topic yesterday. And the bottom line here is, of course, peers are important, but the early attachment history is a foundation for successfully engaging the world of peers, and then you get the stuff that you can get from peers. Okay, mental health or pathology I'll spend a little more time on. Oops, got to do this one first. And I'm glad I have this slide in here.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite things because it has to do with why would early experience have lasting impact? And part of it is because of the kinds of influence it has on your later experience. So kids like Thomas in preschool are rejected by the other children, partly because of his disruptive behavior, of course, because he can be mean at times. And so the very children that could use the positive input of peers are less likely to get it. The same with the teachers. This was a very interesting sub-study that we did. We filmed extensively in our preschool classrooms, and then we made edited tapes by, it took forever to do this, to index all the films so we could make an edited tape of every encounter a particular teacher had with a particular child. So if you're a coder and you're going to watch these videotapes, you just see like 50 or 100 interactions between this teacher and this child. And your job is to rate how the teacher treats the child. Tolerance means sometimes teachers let kids get away with breaking rules, and sometimes they don't. And they tend to let kids break rules that they think are immature and can't really do any better. Whereas with the kids that have secure histories, they hold high expectations for them. No, Ned, you can do better than that. I know you can do better than that. Whereas with some kids, they'll let it go. Control means what you might think. It's how many directives and physical manipulations does a teacher do of a child. And of course, with children like Thomas, the teachers were highly controlling. And with children like Serena, they weren't. Expectations for compliance, how can you measure that? It actually turns out to be pretty straightforward. You're watching the tape and the teacher says, Chuck, I want you to go over there and get some lemonade. And then the teacher just turns and is going about her business. Why? Because she knows Chuck's going to do it. That's high expectation for compliance. Or on the other hand, she says, Chuck, I want you to go over and get that. Chuck, come on, Chuck, come on. Then you know she doesn't expect him to comply. It was a fascinating variable, and it was very interesting to see. Of course, they didn't expect Thomas to comply, and they expected the Serenas to comply. This study came out very powerfully with all these variables. The only children our nursery school teachers ever got angry at were kids with histories like Thomas, with avoidant attachment, and the children that they infantilized or treated like they were much younger children were all the kids with resistant attachments. Okay, now here's the psychopathology data. Resistant attachment, remember, are the kids that had difficulty being settled and they were hovering near their mothers all the time and were unable to explore. In a way, you could describe their relationship as infants as being a very anxious relationship. They were uncertain, profoundly uncertain about whether or not their mother would come through for them. And it's quite interesting that that forecasts later anxiety problems. And anxiety and depression are so comorbid that it's not surprising that it also predicts depression. I put on the interaction with infant temperament because it's one of the few places that we found temperament to be significant. And when we did find it to be significant, it was as an interactive variable. So this was from Brazelton neonatal exams. And we found that some highly reactive infants, if they also had anxious resistant attachment at 12 months, that combination predicted anxiety problems better than anxious resistant attachment alone, and far better than that temperamental variation alone. So the kids with avoidant histories have conduct problems. And the kids with disorganized attachment, what I mean by general pathology is we did psychiatric interviews, standard intake interviews that are done at clinics in order to make DSM categories. And general pathology refers to the number of symptoms irregardless of the category. And dissociation, I don't know if you all are familiar with what that means. I'll give you some example items from the dissociative experiences scale. I often find myself someplace and don't know how I got there. I don't want to say some others because they're true of me. So. But dissociation has to do with a segregation in your experience, a lack of awareness of hunks of your experience. And it's very interesting because the disorganized infant had no choice but to block off aspects of its early experience. That was the only way to cope with a frightening parent. And the fact that this is a prototype for later dissociation is quite interesting. Okay. This is going to be the last slide I'm going to talk about because I want to get to discussion. This study is very multifaceted and almost any aspect you want to ask about, like if you want to ask about daycare or whatever, yes, of course, we looked at daycare. Anything you want to ask, foster care placement, special ed, anything. But I'm going to say my favorite things first. There's a great deal of interest in Minnesota in the problem of resilience. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Ann Masson, is very famous as a resilience researcher. We have a very particular take on resilience. Mostly, I would say that resilience is a name for a phenomenon. It's not an explanation. For example, some kids who are born in poverty develop well. And we could say, okay, they're resilient. Well, what do you mean resilient? Well, they develop well even though they were in poverty. Well, yes, but I just told you they develop well even though they're in poverty. Or some kids who have behavior problems at one age, at a later age don't. They're resilient, right? What do you mean by resilient? Well, they had behavior problems, now they don't. Well, yes, I just told you that. So how does telling me they're resilient explain anything to me? Or finally, some kids in the face of stress don't show behavior problems. Some kids in the face of stress do. So those kids who in the face of stress don't show behavior problems are resilient. Again, it's just a name for it. Now, that's not unuseful, because it calls our attention to this phenomenon, but it's not an explanation. And it has lent itself to an interpretation of some inherent differences in kids. You know, some kids just have the right stuff. I'm not comfortable with such explanations. I think it's first of all, it's not theoretically very deep to say some kids just are. And our work suggests that it's not an inherent characteristic of children. The kids in our study who were resistant to stress, for example, the kids who recovered from periods of behavior problems, were not distinguished by any measure of early temperament that we had. And for the most part, in a sample like ours, they're not distinguished by IQ. So our view is that resilience is a developmental outcome. And it's always, once you understand the developmental history of a child and the current circumstance, you understand those two things, resilience essentially disappears. So, that brings me to the last bullet point here. We did some examples where we set up groups of children. And I'll just define one example of this. We established one group of children who showed consistent behavior problems from age 2.5 to age 5. That group of, and to that point, it's one group of kids. But then we divided them into two groups by establishing a group of children who had consistent behavior problems from age 2.5 to 5, but had early positive beginnings. And another group that had behavior problems from 2.5 to 5 who had early negative beginnings. Or as simple as some kids with secure attachments nonetheless have behavior problems between age 2.5 to 5. More kids who have anxious attachments have behavior problems, but nonetheless you can set up these two groups. And the question is, are they one group or two groups? If early experience is erased, they're just one group. They're all kids who have problems. How can you answer this question? Are they really two groups? Well, it's simpler. Let's look in later. So for example, when they're 8 years old. And now we'll look at the level of behavior problems. And we did find, that those who had problems in the preschool period but had early secure attachments had fewer behavior problems at age 8 than their comparison group, even though the level of behavior problems was comparable between age 2.5 and 5. So now, if we just started the study at age 5, it would have been kind of a mystery. Some of these kids get better, some don't. Well, some are resilient. But one explanation for why they're resilient is they had a secure base to build upon. Then the other factor you can bring in is changes in life stress and social support for the family in the intervening years. And lo and behold, that also accounts for some of the variance. So the kids whose families reported reduced life stress and or increased support, those children showed fewer behavior problems at age 8 than the kids whose families didn't report those positive changes. And when you take those two things together, which we did at a variety of ages, they account for a whole lot of the variance in what could be called resilience. So there are two parts about that. One is explaining that resilience is not some magical quality of kids. It's an understandable developmental phenomenon. And two is that early experience actually isn't erased following developmental change. And we've become increasingly interested in that as our participants are now 35 years old, because we're able to look at adult relationships, we're able to look at how they're parenting their children, and a lot of other adult outcomes. I think I gave this example to some just in discussion yesterday, but one real good example is depression. Depression is often cyclical, or episodic is a better term for it, meaning that people who struggle with depression are more or less depressed at different times. And you can find people who are depressed in adolescence who are not depressed in early adulthood. In our sample, we found people like that. Even though depression in adolescence on the whole predicts having problems with depression in adulthood too, but there's change. Now, what accounts for that? One thing that accounts for that is what happened in the years between adolescence and adulthood. And the most significant thing we found is those people who formed a stable, supportive partnership in the intervening years more likely remitted their depression. Now, the most interesting part of the study to me is that the people who found that supportive partner relationship and remitted depression more likely had secure attachment in infancy. So in other words, the opportunity for change that presented itself is important, but so is the capacity to take advantage of that opportunity. And that's where the early history also remains important. So Mike is an adult, is a loving partner, a devoted, responsible dad, responsive, I should have said, but he's also responsible. So his early experience wasn't lost, but you know what? Neither was the hardship he faced. He's still very reserved, and in fact, in interviews with his wife, she described him as having great difficulty opening up and sharing his feelings with her. Of course, that's like 85% of the people of my gender. But she went on to say, but you know, he's really working on it. I mean, he's an amazing story. The whole story is amazing. And I know you can't conclude anything from individual case studies. I say it just to illustrate. Our group data supports the same thing. That if he hadn't had that early positive beginning, and he had that stuff happen to him in middle childhood, it would be less likely that he could have become the adult he is. That's all. It's all probabilistic. I'll stop there. I think I already told my joke, which I was going to have come up here on the slide, so I'll stop and hear your questions.